most important thing that the city changed in terms of accountability is its current system of arbitration, and this contract does that.
That's a city staff member there, Greg Doss, talking about what some are describing as a sea change in police accountability, a new contract agreement with the Seattle Police Management Association, one of two police unions the city works with. So what's changed in that contract? Plus, what's the city council saying about the alignment of Sound Transit Light Rail? And what's going on with that parking ticket you got last year? Well, some points to ponder here on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are my own, and I'm joined by David Croman of the Seattle Times. David, I loved your recent post about that FX show, What Do We Do in the Shadows, which is kind of a vampire show, but municipal government also plays a starring role. How would you describe it?
Yeah, I don't know. That's one of my favorite shows. It's like The Office, but of vampires.
It's so silly. Yeah.
But yeah, there's a in the second episode, they decide they're going to try and take over Staten Island by attending a municipal zoning board meeting. It's just a great scene.
It's incredible. And I will say, if vampires do take over Seattle City Hall or any other, we'll make sure we bring it to you on the podcast here. Thank you, David, as always, for joining me. Thanks to all of our listeners. Again, we're joining you a little bit later on Tuesdays now to make sure we're getting all the latest updates on agendas from Seattle City Hall. Thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor for the audio podcast on the first floor of City Hall. Make sure you check them out. Thanks especially to our patrons. We need you. We love you. We can't do it without you. Please do consider giving, folks. We will send a Seattle News, Views, and Brews coffee mug to you, to our $10 a month supporters, and you get a special mention on our mugshot of the week. This week, it's Robert, with a mug set up in what appears to be his home library. Well, keep listening, keep reading. Thanks for the photo, Robert. Thanks for supporting Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. If you are a patron, send us a photo. If you're not a patron, really consider jumping in here. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks to Converge Media 2. The video of the podcast airs on Converge Wednesday nights at 7. All right, off we go with right here, right now. Well, David, I want to start with the agreement the city has now apparently reached with the Seattle Police Management Association. So this is the smaller of the two police unions the city deals with, includes captains and lieutenants. Before we get to the dollars and cents involved, which is very important here, I want to talk about what this contract does to change the accountability system the city has in place now. So three main pieces. Bear with me, everybody. I'm just going to get this out there. So number one, currently, let's say the chief of police issues some discipline. That sets off an arbitration process where a whole new, quote, trial can begin. New evidence can be brought in, new witnesses that can favor the officer. Well, that process has been changed. So whatever the chief sees now, that's what goes to the arbitrator working on the case. And number two, that arbitrator will now be a neutral arbitrator, picked from a state list of neutral reviewers. And three, currently, there's a legal standard in place that says the evidence in these cases has to be, quote, clear and convincing to make a disciplinary decision. The New Deal negotiates a lower standard, a preponderance of evidence, as it's called. And that discipline could be lowered only if the reviewer finds the chief was arbitrary or capricious in his or her decision. David, I know a ton of background there, but I wanted to get it out there. I know also you've spent some time as a shop steward in your day. I know the fine print is very important here. Do you see this new contract with SPMA as a breakthrough when it comes to accountability?
I don't know. I mean, I think that remains to be seen. I think a lot of the biggest concerns that a lot of folks have with police accountability and reform, in some ways, are kind of state level issues. I mean, the ability to choose a neutral arbitrator, I think that's significant because there was this previous practice of kind of shopping for arbitrators that were seen to be the most favorable. But it doesn't really solve this problem, this broader problem that keeps getting brought up of how when cases do go to arbitration and they're concluded, that sets a precedent for future cases. So if it's sort of it's almost like a race to the bottom in some ways, which is if one person somewhere kind of gets off through arbitration, then future arbitrators are going to look to that case and make similar rulings, and that creates this system where we've seen this over and over where people go to arbitration and then have their punishments reduced. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I'll be. I don't know if this is. It sounds like these are kind of improvements to the accountability system. Whether or not this kind of represents any sort of sea change, we'll see. I'm a little skeptical.
I always am too with these kind of situations. And I'm just trying to think this through about how this might influence negotiations of the SPOG contract, which is the much larger union of rank and file officers here. And any thoughts on how that might play out in relation to this?
I think that's in a lot of ways a different animal. I mean, the last contract also SPMA came out first. My hunch is this one. I mean, last time it was maybe 7 or 8 months in advance of the SPOG contract. I think this one's going to be years, because I'm not even sure. I'm not even sure how many times the two sides have met to negotiate. A lot of the negotiations with SPOG were put on hold during COVID, and then I'm not sure. I don't cover this as much anymore, so I don't know if they've restarted. I haven't had any indication of how often they've actually met. And we know that SPOG is, it's led by Mike Solon. He's kind of described as a hardliner. He ran and won the position of president of SPOG on the platform of, I'm going to fight back on behalf of police. So, and it's a much bigger union, and it's going to be under a lot more scrutiny. I would say probably a majority of Seattle probably doesn't really even understand that SPMA is a union that exists. Whereas people have a acute understanding, I think, since the George Floyd protests, that there is this large officers union. And so that's going to be a much hairier thing. And cut myself off here in a second, but one thing that is interesting, that a recommendation that came up during the last round of negotiations was that the city should be negotiating the SPMA and SPOG contracts at the same time. Of course, that didn't happen, as we're seeing right now. But the argument then being, if you do these things separately, then SPOG just can kind of wait and then see what SPMA gets. And then suddenly, in some ways, those issues are off the table, because SPOG already knows that here's our base now, because we can look at SPMA's contract and know that the city is at the very least willing to do these things. And then we kind of start from there. And so it puts SPOG in, frankly, a better bargaining position, that they already know what SPMA has extracted from the city. And so it's interesting, that's just kind of an aside in some ways, that recommendation, which came from the auditor at the time, has not come to fruition.
Yeah, that's an important part of this, I know. And I just think about this with the dollars. I want to make sure we come back to this, because a very important twist here. There are some raises involved for officers with SPMA through this deal. 2.7, 1.9, and 4% over the life of this deal. Not huge numbers here, but definitely an increase. This contract, as it stands right now, would expire at the end of 2023, because remember, this is a contract that expired at the end of 2019. But paying for those raises, well, the city does have some funds in reserve for that, but the mayor is saying he wants to use the salary savings the SPD has from not hiring as many officers this year to cover this instead. So we've talked about the savings quite a bit over the past couple of weeks, David. $4.5 million is the figure you've seen thrown around there for not hiring more officers. But if this amount that would go towards the SPMA deal would be taken from that surplus there, then that surplus gets cut to about $1 million or so. And I'm just trying to figure out what sort of calculus starts running through your head here, politically or financially, when you think about those numbers.
It's a good question. I mean, this salary savings, everybody wants to get their hands on these salary savings, and we've been debating this now for years, where this money goes. So, I don't know. I mean, when there's money that's unclaimed, we tend to see these fights over people trying to claim it. But if this contract is ratified, the money's going to need to come from somewhere. Like it or not, that if it's in a contract, they have to pay it. So, whether it comes from this particular pot or from a different program, the city's going to have to figure it out somewhere. So it just kind of depends on which pot it's coming out of.
Always. Yeah. And it's one of those budget fights that we see a few of these, always kind of a preview of coming attractions in the earlier part of the year. So definitely seeing something here in June that's going to be playing out this fall as the council goes through its budget process, which it always wraps up at around Thanksgiving time. So definitely a lot of runway ahead on that one. So I wanted to talk about a few other issues on the docket this week for the council. It looks like we're going to have a new head of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs in Hamdi Mohammed. We also have Michael Winkler Chin about to be approved as the permanent head of the Office of Housing. there's a public forum this week as well for the candidates who want to be the OPA director too. So a lot cooking here. But David, I wanted to talk about Sound Transit because the city council in its transportation committee meeting this week, happening just as we're releasing the show actually, is talking about the city's preferred alternatives for the extension of light rail to Ballard and West Seattle. A ton to consider here, I know, but I wanted to look at what the council isn't saying. Specifically, the council says it has no recommendation for a Chinatown ID station, says not enough mitigation strategies for construction have been put in place, other concerns too. And this part of the project in Chinatown ID has received so much scrutiny. I'm trying to look at this balance, David, between, yes, it would be great to serve the CID with a station, sure, but would you significantly harm the neighborhood through the process of building a transit stop there?
This is, I mean, the fact that they're not issuing a recommendation, I think, is telling of how kind of tricky this decision is, because, you know, there's sort of two things at play here, which is, you know, I mean, it seems that there's going to be a station kind of somewhere in this, a second station somewhere in the CID. The big question at this point is, well, one, do you put it on Fifth Avenue, kind of, you know, on the street that's the kind of western street of Owajimaya by the gate, the historic gate there?
Yep.
Or do you put it on Fourth Avenue, which is where that big road is? Fifth Avenue in the community, at least as far as I have gleaned from the things that I've read, I haven't done much reporting on it myself, but Fifth Avenue seems to be kind of a non-starter for a lot of the people that live in the neighborhood because, you know, it would necessitate tearing down some businesses that are there right now. It would mean wrapping the historic gate permanently, or not, you know, for a few years to protect it from debris. It would mean, you know, kind of getting in the way of a neighborhood that, you know, we all understand has been through a lot, both, you know, in the last couple of years, but then before that too, there's been a lot of construction and disruptions in that neighborhood for decades. So then you say, well, okay, well, great, we'll just put it on Fourth Avenue. Well, the problem there is that is a very large road that would require an extra $500 million about than what the Fifth Avenue one would cost, and you know, it's so that has its own kind of fairly significant challenges. So yeah, I mean, it's not an easy decision. You know, Mayor Durkin had come out before she left and said that she didn't want this in the heart of CID. She was kind of siding with the community members there, but we haven't heard a lot from Mayor Harrell on this, and haven't heard a lot, like, apparently from the city council on this either. So yeah, it's a really tricky and kind of interesting in some ways problem that I don't know that anyone would claim to have a great solution to at this point.
No, and it's important to point out that Mayor Harrell, in his run for mayor, certainly was talking about his Asian heritage and got a lot of support from the CID in terms of that. He's also on the Sound Transit Board with Council President Juarez, so he will play a role in this for sure. But I wanted to talk about those dollars and cents and go a little bit further into that with you, David. And I should mention also there's another no recommendation for a stop along Interbay due to some environmental concerns there. But looking at the dollars, the council memo talking about this points out what looked like a $1.8 billion funding gap for this project last August has been modified to look more like a $2.2 billion gap. That's billion with a B. And just watching those dollars creep up here, what does that really mean? How does that affect the project? I think it means potentially delays, but what do these rising dollar figures really mean to you?
I think it's just, it's a really hard time to do big construction everywhere, really, especially in cities like Seattle, where cost of land is what it is. But yeah, of course, price of materials is going way up. The concrete strike did no favors to anybody because it meant delays, and delays always mean more money. So you know, I think Sound Transit has struggled with this and faced this kind of basically since it for years now. So yeah, I mean, I don't know kind of how they remedy this. I mean, maybe more federal dollars if they can get them somehow, might mean delays. Yeah, it's yeah, I think about the, you know, the high-speed train between Cisco and Los Angeles, and you know, just how much that has expanded. I mean, it's just proving really difficult to do these big projects and keep them from ballooning to large sums of money.
Yeah, no, and I know this is something that Sound Transit's going to be wrestling with over the next several weeks, especially, and a lot still ahead here. The Sound Transit Board expecting to vote on a preferred alternatives for these different routes here. Get that out of committee by mid-July, then a final full board approval on July 28th. And remember, Council President Juarez, Mayor Harrell serve on that board. They're definitely going to be taking a lot of input in between now and then. All right. Well, thank you for that, David. And up next, a very interesting story here, a disturbing story, as a matter of fact, about police funding and how that impacts how the SPD is able or not able to process cases of sexual assault. Let's learn some more on Now Hear This. Well, the Seattle police are investigating fewer sexual assault cases, as reported by KUOW and the Seattle Times here. 1.6% of cases investigated by SPD's Sexual Assault and Child Abuse Unit have resulted in an arrest, down from 14% in 2019. As KUOW reporter Ashley Haruko told us back in April, this is at least in part a function of the SPD having fewer officers to deploy, and the emphasis the mayor has put on dealing with high visibility public safety issues.
For example, officers being sent to help clean tent encampments in Seattle, officers in the community response group, which are doing emphasis patrols. But at the same time, none of these officers are being trained in landing in the sexual assault and child abuse unit, which is down to 4 detectives now, which was at 8 officers as of last summer.
David, a difficult story to report here. The Seattle Times actually reported recently that SPD's sex assault and child abuse unit is so overworked that it has stopped assigning new cases with adult victims to detectives, just trying to deal with a state law requiring prompt attention to cases involving kids. What do you make about all this? This whole idea of where the SPD is allocating its staff is a very sensitive issue.
It is, yeah. I mean, it's not like victims advocates or a lot of victims advocates were necessarily saying that the response before this was great from the Seattle Police Department. I mean, I think this is famously, we know that people are often very hesitant to report sexual assault because there's a perception, I think often a warranted perception that doing so kind of often puts the victims through hell, frankly, and doesn't produce kind of results. And this is true across the country. We know this, but
just been through a Johnny Depp trial, for goodness sakes.
Right.
Yeah, keep going. Mm-hmm.
Right. But the fact that it has gotten as bad as it has, certainly doesn't help things and definitely hurts things. And so, I think what the Seattle Police Department says is, they're frankly, they're low on staff, and it's not so easy as just moving people around. That when it comes to sexual assault investigations, this is kind of a special training, and these are detectives who have a certain expertise. That said, there's certainly a argument to be made, and I think a legitimate one, that the city councils kind of, although they didn't vote to quote ever defund the police, we did see kind of a large exodus of police officers following some of the talk about defunding the police, and I know that that's an issue. And so we're in a position where the Seattle Police Department has a lot fewer staff than it did, and then also at a time when people are highly sensitive to perceptions of crime. And Bruce Harrell, who ran and won convincingly on saying he was going to get his arms around sort of low-level crime, we've seen hotspots in certain areas on 3rd Avenue where there's like a lot more police officers. There's a lot of priority on homeless encampments and police officers involved there. And when you do that, and Chief Diaz has said in the past that when faced with staff shortages, he is going to prioritize patrol. He's going to put
triage it. Yeah, of course.
Right. He's going to take detectives and put them on patrol. And so, I think it's a few things are happening, which is, one, that there's obviously a staffing shortage, but 2, you could also, make an argument about priorities, which is, sure, yes, of course, these are specialized detectives who have a specialized training set. Also, they got that training set somewhere.
Right.
It seems that people could be retrained. This is officers go through training all the time. And so yeah, it's a really hairy situation, and I think in some ways is sort of a Rorschach test for how you view the kind of general tenor around public safety and policing that you can read into this. Either this is a vast misprioritization of resources by the Seattle Police Department, focusing on things like homeless encampments and the wrong, or you can see this as this is the natural consequences of casual talk about defunding the police.
I guess, and I keep looking at that issue and just, I mean, I know the SPD is trying to hire officers right now, but it can't keep up with the loss of officers that it's dealing with. And I know we've touched on this a ton, but even with the SPD working very hard and now having a better plan in place, I think, to with the city council's help to recruit new officers, et cetera. We just talked about that a couple of weeks ago. It's just trying to get those numbers back up there. It's not as easy as flipping a switch. I mean, this is something that's going to take time. Officers have to go through the pipeline, get the training and whatever else. I feel like this is an issue that, yes, we're talking about it with the real and current problems with sexual assault cases, but this is something that's going to take a while to right itself if indeed the Seattle City Council and the SPD can work together to get the numbers where they want them.
Right. And this is not, I think it's always useful to remember that this is not just a Seattle thing. I mean, you read, of course, or even a Seattle Police Department thing, even within Seattle, we know that, for example, the King County Public Defender's Office and the King County Correctionals Union, which are not two bodies that often come together on issues, issued a joint statement kind of raising concerns about how few staff there are in the jails right now because the correctionals officers can't get enough staff. And go to basically any city right now and you're gonna find the same story of police departments losing officers and having a really hard time recruiting them. And so including in cities where the phrase defund the police probably never came up.
That's right.
And so it is you can certainly make arguments that the city council maybe exacerbated the issue, but it is not. This is a nationwide issue that is without easy, certainly without easy short-term fix.
No,
and we're seeing it in the consequences of both the number of officers in the police department and then how the police department that is there now is how Chief Diaz is choosing to prioritize where those staff go. And right now not in sexual assault investigations.
No, you're right. And just continuing with the story of police funding, I wanted to shift gears if I could and talk about parking tickets, a refund in order for thousands of people in Seattle. I know you've talked about this, reported about this, another front page story for you and the Seattle Times about this problem. But looking at this, the seeds of this really were planted when the city council moved the parking division of the SPD into the Department of Transportation last year. This created a bit of a waterfall effect here, or maybe a domino effect would be a better way to describe it. Can you give us some of the background on what happened here and how we got to where we are, where literally tens of thousands, more than 100,000 people, I guess, are going to be getting a refund on parking tickets?
Yeah, so this was part of, there was this momentum to reduce the footprint of the Seattle Police Department. And this was unanimously shared opinion in City Hall. For all the rancor of 2020, the mayor and the city council were on the same page about this. There was some debate around where these parking enforcement officers would go, but there was agreement, even from the parking enforcement officers, that
they wanted to do this. Yeah,
they wanted to do this. What they didn't want, though, is a lot of the parking enforcement officers did not want to go to the Seattle Department of Transportation. That was a contentious decision. But for me, and so what happened is when they finally were moved to SDOT, they were never granted this special commission from Seattle Police Department to perform law enforcement actions now that they were no longer in the Seattle Police Department. And so they went 7 months without having this commission, which meant basically for 7 months they were writing tickets that they didn't have the authority to write. I am still trying to do more follow-up reporting on this because it's pretty mind-boggling how this happens, and it's it shouldn't have been a surprise because if there were communications at the time back in July of 2020 between council people and parking enforcement talking about special commissions. And if you read the original piece of legislation, it makes explicit mention of special commissions. And so it should not have been this should not have been a thing that people didn't know they needed because it was fairly written. It's written out. And so the question for me, when I don't know the answer right now, is who didn't write this special commission, and then how did it finally come up in April? Because my sense is when it finally did come up in early April, it became a matter of urgency that basically parking enforcement officers were told to like get this now. And so something alerted the mayor's office to this problem, and I'm trying to figure out what exactly.
Wow, that it's an issue, and I think about a city council that was definitely overworked over the past couple of years. Those staff members too, in terms of going through a budget process, a rebalancing process, going through a budget on a yearly process rather than a biannual process. So a lot of work has been done, and I know there's a lot of great people there that dot I's and cross T's and whatever else, but such a major piece here. And I just wanted to follow up on one piece, how it impacts situations where cars might have gotten towed, impounded, sold off at auction. Your colleague Danny Westneat wrote about this recently, and I thought this was a possible twist here, and I didn't know if any more would be made of that side of things.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I mean, that was a little less clear, but if we've determined that parking tickets are no longer valid, then it seems like impoundments would probably fall into that category. We don't know the answer for sure. So for me, the question is, I mean, that's going to be a lot hairier of a thing to untangle, because parking tickets, you can just kind of click a button in the system and either cancel them or refund them, send them back to the last known address. But parking tickets, I mean, tows are all, you've got a private company involved, you got tow trucks involved, they make money off of this thing. So are they going to have to pay these people back? Is there liability here? I don't know. I think it's, I think another thing that somebody told me recently was having the special commission also gave those parking enforcement officers access to databases to look up license plate numbers and kind of run searches on them. So they didn't have that for
I guess several months there.
7 months basically, where they were not members. And I think the implications of this are deeper than we know already, and I'm curious to learn more.
Wow. Thank you for that, David. Some great reporting on that. All right. Well, up next, why is the demand for Uber rides in our region lagging behind other states as we try to emerge from the pandemic? That's coming up on Transportation Talk. Well, David, I guess looking at our last story in this one, kind of a rock block of transportation stories, but I want to stick with it. And I really appreciate the way you've been diving into these different pieces here, because you recently wrote a story about how the trips Seattleites would normally be taking on Uber and Lyft, well, they cratered, of course, during the pandemic, and they haven't really rebounded as they have in other parts of the country. What's going on here?
Well, yeah, it's really interesting because the companies claim, and they don't provide a lot of data to back this up, so we can't totally verify this, but they claim that nationwide they're back up to close to 70% of what they were pre-pandemic. But if you look at Seattle's numbers, it's more like 40%, and actually the last quarter it was down to like 35-36%, so way below, and even slower to return than some transit ridership, although it's correlates fairly closely. And so the question of why, for one, what drivers say is tech workers have not come back downtown.
Yeah, okay.
And if you think about the people who were most consistently taking Uber and Lyft rides, and longer and more profitable Uber and Lyft rides, it was tech workers commuting into work because they have the money to do it, but they're also kind of, they're very tech savvy and maybe don't feel like they needed a car and are happy to just kind of use this technology. And those people are also the people who are still working from home. So they just have not returned. And you can see that in office vacancies are still, the number of people working downtown is still in the craters. It's 30-40%.
Yeah.
So that's what the drivers say is kind of the big factor here. Airport traffic is still not the same as it was, and that's big money in the Uber and Lyft world. The companies and some of the advocates on behalf of the companies are also making the argument that Seattle's minimum wage for Uber and Lyft is depressing ridership. That is a super hard claim to verify because we don't have good data, because the companies tend to be really protective of this data. We can get it though because of a Supreme Court decision in the state. and so it's really tough to kind of compare to other cities. Although that does get at a larger thing, which is if you look nationwide at the cost of Uber and Lyft, it's gone way up.
Yeah.
Because these companies are facing a really tough stretch right now, where their very business model, I think, is kind of it's kind of a test point. It's a existential moment, like whether or not these models actually work. And we're seeing them raise prices, and as they raise prices, people are less and less willing to take these. And so for me, the question is this kind of in the world of transit where maybe as people come back to the office, they start taking this again, or is this kind of indicative of a larger death spiral of these companies? I don't know.
Ooh, man. Yeah. And just people being comfortable getting in these different rigs or on a bus or whatever else. COVID plays a role here. Gas prices, of course, I know play a role here too. So many different factors here. Thank you for that breakdown, David. But we need to start wrapping up here. And I wanted to mention, you've got a big following on social media, and I didn't know how big until a couple of days ago when you commented on the dreary weather we're having, and then almost immediately the sun came out. So first you tweet on the Mariners, they start winning. Then you start affecting weather patterns. I just wanted to say, man, great power comes great responsibility. Use it carefully. I
know. Maybe it's time to delete my Twitter account. It's too much.
How powerful can it be? David, thank you, as always, for bringing back the sun and everything else you do. I appreciate it, my man. Thanks to everybody listening, too. It's Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is available on all the major platforms. And once again, if you are a listener, please do support the show on Patreon. It would be greatly appreciated. Thanks also for watching on Converge Media as well. We will see you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2022.